Before Ragnar became the name feared across the seas, before kings bolted their doors at the mention of him, before his sons carried his legend into the heart of England, soaked in blood and smoke, he was just a farmer with a dream nobody believed in. Tonight we slip into the cold edge of a Scandinavian coastline, somewhere between the 9th century and the long memory of the skalds who sang of it afterward. The wind moves low over dark water. A man stands on a ridge above his own fields, looking not at the crops behind him, but at the horizon in front of him, a horizon that, as far as anyone in his village is concerned, simply ends, falls away, means nothing. He does not know yet that history will remember him as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar of the shaggy breeches, the man who slew a serpent for love, who raided Paris and took its silver, who sailed to England with too few ships and too much pride, and who died laughing in a pit of snakes while his sons swore the kind of revenge that ends civilizations. Tonight, he is no king, he is no legend. He is a man with calloused hands, a half-built boat, and a question that nobody else in his village is brave enough, or foolish enough, to ask out loud. What is out there? This is his story. Slow at first, the way every great story is slow at first. Because legends are never born in a single afternoon. They are built morning after morning, doubt after doubt, until one day the farmer is gone, and only the warrior remains. So settle in. Let the fire of your own room burn low, if you have one, and let the past come find you instead. The village where Ragnar grows up does not look like the Viking world you have seen in films and television dramas, all horned helmets and dragon-proud ships gliding triumphantly into foreign harbors. It looks smaller than that, poorer than that, more honest than that. A cluster of timber longhouses huddled along a fjord, roofs heavy with turf, smoke curling from holes in the thatch, the smell of salt and fish and wood smoke threading through every lane between the houses. Life here runs on a rhythm older than memory. You wake before the sun, because the sun in this part of the world is a stingy, reluctant thing for half the year. You tend animals that would rather not be tended. You work soil that gives up its harvest slowly and grudgingly, as if the land itself is suspicious of generosity. You mend nets. You sharpen tools. You watch the sky the way other men might watch a rival, because the sky here can turn from indifferent to murderous within an hour. Historians still argue over how much of Ragnar Lothbrok's life is rooted in a single real man, and how much is the accumulated legend of many Viking raiders, stitched together over centuries by storytellers who loved a good tale more than they loved precision. The earliest detailed accounts of his life come from sources written 13th century Iceland, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok chief among them, composed roughly 300 to 400 years after the events it claims to describe. Other glimpses of a man who might be him appear far earlier, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and in the writings of the Frankish monks, who watched his ships appear on their rivers like a curse made of wood and iron. Some scholars believe these scattered mentions describe one extraordinary individual. Others believe the name Ragnar became a kind of vessel, through a hook on which later generations hung the achievements of several different raiders, because every culture needs at least one hero large enough to hold an entire age. What seems beyond serious dispute is this. Somewhere in the early decades of the 9th century, in the lands we now call Scandinavia, a man rose from modest beginnings to lead some of the most consequential raids of the Viking Age. Raids that struck Francia, raids that struck the British Isles, raids that planted the first seeds of a conquest his sons would later finish with terrifying completeness. Whether that man was born a farmer in the way the sagas describe is impossible to confirm. But the shape of the story, an ordinary man clawing his way toward an extraordinary destiny, echoes something true about how the Viking world actually worked. This was not, in its earliest decades, a world ruled only by hereditary kings sitting on unquestioned thrones. It was a world where ambition, luck, and raw nerve could lift a man from nothing into legend. and where the sea itself was the great equalizer, indifferent to whose father owned what land. So picture him as a young man on that ridge above the fields, broad through the shoulders from years of farm labor, his hands marked with the small, permanent scars that come from rope and blade and stone. His clothes are plain wool, undyed, patched at the elbow. There is nothing about his appearance that would make a stranger glance twice. And that, perhaps, is the first quiet tragedy of his early life. He looks like everyone else. He is expected to live like everyone else. Marry, farm, raise children who will farm after him, grow old slowly inside the boundaries of a village that has not changed its shape in generations. But something in him refuses the shape. It is a restlessness that the people around him do not entirely understand and are not entirely comfortable with. In a village this small, comfort comes from sameness. Everyone knows the rhythm. Everyone knows their place in it. A man who stares too long at the horizon, who asks too many questions about what lies beyond the known fishing grounds, who spends his rare free evenings not drinking with the other men, but sketching crude shapes of ships in the dirt with a stick, becomes a small irritant to the order of things. Not dangerous, not yet, just odd. His father, if the old tellings carry any grain of truth, is a man of some local standing, perhaps even a minor chieftain, or a man descended from one, which would explain how Ragnar later moves so easily among warriors and kings, rather than remaining trapped at the bottom of his society forever. Sagas place him as the son of a king named Sigurd Hring, ruler of Sweden, a connection that lends Ragnar a noble bloodline, even in his most humble years. Whether this lineage is fact, flattering invention, or something in between is impossible to know with certainty this far from the events themselves. What matters for the shape of the story is simpler. Even with some inherited standing, young Ragnar has not yet earned anything of his own. A name attached to a father is not the same as a name that means something on its own. And it is that second kind of name, the kind a man builds himself, plank by plank, voyage by voyage, that he wants more than anything else. The other young men of the village do not share this hunger, or if they do, they have learned to bury it. They sail the routes their fathers sailed, east mostly, along the familiar trading paths toward the Baltic, toward the rivers that wind down into the lands of the Rus, toward markets where furs and amber change hands for silver. These routes are known. They are dangerous in the ordinary ways. The sea is always dangerous, but they are not mysteries. Every current is mapped in the memory of every captain. Every harbor has a name passed down through 3 generations of sailors. Ragnar listens to the old captains describe these routes around the fire, and he listens for what they do not say. He notices that nobody, not one voice in the village, ever speaks with any certainty about what lies to the west. There are rumors, half-myths, carried back by traders who heard them from other traders who heard them from someone else entirely. Lands across open water, rich, fertile, full of treasure and undefended monasteries glittering with silver and gold that nobody has yet thought to take. But rumors are not routes. Nobody has charted the crossing. Nobody in living memory has simply turned their prow west into open ocean and kept going until land appeared. It would be easy, looking back from the comfort of centuries, to make this sound like simple bravery, a hero answering destiny's call. But sit with the actual texture of the moment for longer than that, and a more complicated emotion appears. It is not only courage that pulls Ragnar toward the unknown. It is also a kind of suffocation, the feeling of a life mapped out so completely, so far in advance, that there is nothing left to decide. He can see his entire future from where he stands on that ridge. The same fields, worked a little more each year, until his body cannot work them anymore. The same faces, aging together in the same small radius of land. A funeral, eventually, no different from every funeral that came before it in this village. His name remembered for 2 generations and then folded quietly into the dirt with everyone else's. He wants, more than silver, more than glory, simply to know, to stand somewhere no one from his village has ever stood, and look at something no one from his village has ever seen. It is the oldest hunger humans carry, the one that has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with the unbearable size of an unexplored world, pressing against the smallness of a single known life. This hunger does not announce itself all at once. It builds the way frost builds on a window, one quiet layer at a time, until one morning you look up and the whole pain is changed. It is said that the moment the idea finally takes its full shape in him comes not from a vision or a dream, but from something far more ordinary. A trader, weathered and half drunk, returning from the eastern routes with a story he picked up second-hand from a man who had once spoken to a sailor, blown wildly off course by a storm. The sailor, the story goes, drifted further west than anyone intended, far past the edges of any known chart, and glimpsed land before the storm dragged him back toward safer water. Green land, unfamiliar coastline, no ships of his own people anywhere near it. It is the kind of story that gets told 100 times in 100 different ports, embellished a little more with each telling, and most men who hear it forget it by morning, filed away with every other tall tale traded for free ale. But Ragnar does not forget it. He turns it over for weeks. He asks the trader to repeat it, presses him on details the man clearly does not actually have, tries to extract a map from a story that was never built to hold one, and slowly, almost without choosing to, he begins to believe it. This is the moment the slow burn of his early life starts to catch. Not an explosion, a kindling. He begins spending his evenings not at the hearth with the other men, but down by the shore, studying the boats that exist, turning them over in his mind, imagining what would need to change about their design to survive an open crossing rather than the cautious, coast-hugging journeys most ships in his village are built for. He talks to the handful of older shipwrights who still remember techniques from their fathers, asking questions that make them frown, not because the questions are foolish, but because nobody has needed those answers in a generation. Word travels in a village this size the way smoke travels in a closed room. It fills every corner, whether anyone wants it to or not. And so it reaches the ears of the men who hold actual power, the local chieftains and the older, more established leaders whose authority rests on the predictable rhythms of trade and raid that have sustained the region for as long as anyone can remember. They do not take kindly to what they hear. This is the heart of the conflict that defines Ragnar's early life, and it deserves to be understood honestly rather than simplified into a cartoon of stubborn old men against one brave young visionary. The leaders who oppose him are not opposing him out of cruelty or jealousy alone. They are managing real risk for an entire community. Ships are not cheap. The timber, the iron fittings, the months of skilled labor that go into building a single longship represent a significant portion of a community's wealth and effort. Sending a vessel and its crew west into uncharted water, based on a half-remembered second-hand story from a man too drunk to draw a reliable map, looks from where they stand less like ambition and more like throwing a season's harvest into the sea for nothing. There is also the matter of the men themselves. Crews are not anonymous. They are sons, brothers, fathers. A failed eastern voyage is a tragedy a village has grieved before and knows how to survive. A crew lost chasing a rumor into open water that may not even contain land at all is, in the eyes of the older leaders, an unforgivable waste. The kind of decision a community does not forgive easily, even if the man who made it dies, along with everyone else. So when Ragnar finally stands before the assembled leaders of the region, the saga tradition remembers it as a moment of real confrontation, not a polite request granted with a nod. He lays out his case as plainly as he can. The eastern routes are crowded now, picked over by generations of raiders and traders, the easy wealth long since claimed by those who arrived first. Whatever lies to the west has not been touched. If even half the rumors are true, the rewards available to whoever reaches it first would be enormous. Wealth and reputation enough to outlast 100 ordinary eastern voyages. The response, according to the way these stories are remembered, is not a careful debate. It is closer to mockery. He is reminded, in front of the other men of the village, of exactly who he is. not yet a proven warrior, not yet a man whose judgment has earned the kind of trust that justifies risking other men's sons on his word alone. The horizon he wants to chase, they tell him, has swallowed better men than him and given nothing back but silence. Whatever lies past the known world, if anything does at all, is not his to find. It is foolishness dressed up as ambition, and foolishness is a luxury a village this size cannot afford to indulge. It would be easy to imagine this rejection breaking him, and for a while, by every outward appearance it seems to. He returns to his fields. He works the harvest that season, the way he has worked every harvest before it. To anyone watching from the outside, it might look as though the matter has quietly resolved itself, as though the restless young man finally accepted the shape of the life laid out in front of him. But something has shifted underneath the surface, and it does not show itself in dramatic speeches or public defiance. It shows itself in small, patient choices that nobody else notices because nobody else is paying close enough attention. He begins, quietly, to build. Not a full ship at first. He does not have the resources, the labor, or the standing to commandeer that kind of effort, not after being so publicly refused. Instead, he starts small, almost invisibly, the way real change so often begins. He trades extra labor on a neighbor's boat for the use of tools after dark. He sets aside a portion of whatever surplus his land produces, season after season, converting it quietly into the materials a real vessel will eventually require. Iron rivets, properly seasoned timber, set aside to cure rather than burned for warmth, the way most households would use it. Rope, carefully made and stored dry. It is unglamorous work, the kind no saga particularly enjoys lingering on, because there is no clash of swords in it, no thunder of waves against a prow. There is only a man, alone most evenings, doing the slow arithmetic of turning ambition into oak and iron, one careful decision at a time. A mainstream historical detail worth holding on to here, even as the saga details blur into legend, is the simple reality of what Viking shipbuilding actually demanded in this period. A longship capable of true ocean crossing was an extraordinary feat of engineering for its time, built from overlapping oak planks fastened with iron rivets, flexible enough to twist and ride with the waves rather than fight against them, yet strong enough to survive the brutal unpredictability of open sea. Building one was not a weekend's labor. It was the accumulated knowledge of generations of shipwrights refined and passed down, and it required resources that an ordinary farmer, even one with some inherited standing, would not easily command alone. This is part of why the saga's portrait of Ragnar matters regardless of how literally true every detail might be. The story insists that he does not simply wish his way into greatness. He builds toward it, against discouragement, against the practical limits of his own modest resources, against the quiet, grinding doubt of an entire community that has already told him no once and sees no reason to expect a different answer the second time. There are nights during this long stretch of preparation when the doubt is not external at all. It comes from inside him, the way doubt always eventually does, no matter how determined a person believes themselves to be. He works through autumn evenings with cold settling into his hands, and somewhere underneath the methodical labor, a quieter voice asks the question the village leaders already asked him, out loud. What if they were right? What if the story was nothing more than a drunk trader's exaggeration, passed from mouth to mouth until it grew large enough to fool even a man who should know better? It is worth sitting with this version of him for a moment, because the legend that follows can make it easy to forget that the man who eventually becomes one of history's most feared raiders begins as someone who is, in the most human way possible, simply unsure. Unsure whether his instinct is vision or vanity, or only the shape his own restlessness has poured itself into. What separates him, in the end, is not the absence of that doubt. It is what he chooses to do while carrying it. He keeps working, plank by plank, season by season. Not because he is certain of the outcome, but because the alternative, the slow, sure, unremarkable life laid out for him by everyone around him has become, somewhere in the quiet of all those working evenings, unbearable in a way he can no longer talk himself out of. By the time 2 full seasons have passed, the small, patient pile of materials he has been gathering has become something that can no longer be ignored. A keel taking shape in the corner of land he has claimed for the purpose. Planks, cut and curing. The unmistakable skeleton of a ship beginning to rise out of timber and stubbornness. And the village, which had been content to let the matter quietly die, now has to decide what it means that it has not died at all. A half-built ship is a strange kind of announcement. It does not shout. It simply sits there, day after day, growing more undeniable with every plank that joins it, until the entire village has quietly absorbed the fact that the strange, restless farmer they dismissed 2 years earlier was not, in fact, dismissed at all. He simply stopped asking for permission. This is the point in the story where the saga tradition allows Ragnar's first true allies to step into the light. And it is worth noticing how few of them there are. He does not return to the chieftains who mocked him and demand they reconsider. He does not need their blessing anymore, only their indifference, which is, in its own way, easier to earn. Instead, the men who eventually join him are drawn from the margins of the village's social order, younger sons with no land of their own to inherit, a man or two whose reputation has already been quietly damaged by some earlier failure, and who has little left to lose by gambling it on something new. A handful of people who, for their own private reasons, recognize in Ragnar's stubbornness something they have felt themselves and never had the nerve or the opportunity to act on. It is not a crew built from glory. It is a crew built from people with nothing left to protect. There is something quietly moving in this detail, whether or not every name and circumstance survives accurately across the centuries between the events and the writing of the sagas. The first people to believe in a man who will eventually become one of the most feared figures of his age are not powerful men recognizing destiny. They are overlooked men recognizing a chance. Among them, the legends place a woman whose name endures almost as vividly as Ragnar's own. Lagertha, a shield maiden, is said to have entered his life around this period, though the timeline and details shift considerably depending on which version of the saga tradition is being followed. The stories describe her first as fiercely independent, uninterested in being won the way a prize is won, guarding her home with creatures fierce enough to discourage ordinary suitors. Whatever the literal truth buried beneath that image, the symbolic weight of it matters. The woman who stands beside Ragnar in his earliest legendary trials is not a passive figure waiting to be rescued. She is a warrior in her own right, someone whose respect has to be earned through demonstrated courage rather than status or charm. That detail alone tells you something about what the culture producing these stories valued, and about the kind of partnership the storytellers imagined a man like Ragnar would need if he was going to survive what came next. The preparation for departure, once the ship is finally seaworthy, moves quickly by necessity. Word of an unsanctioned voyage spreads fast in a community this size, and there is no guarantee the chieftains who once mocked the idea would not act more forcefully to stop it now that it has become real rather than theoretical. So the final provisioning happens with a kind of urgent quiet. Dried fish and meat, salted heavily enough to survive weeks without spoiling. Fresh water in sealed containers, rationed even before the journey begins because everyone aboard already understands how quickly that ration could become the difference between survival and disaster. Furs and oiled leather for warmth. Against a crossing nobody on board has any reliable way to predict the length of. There is no grand ceremony, no assembled crowd cheering them toward the horizon the way later retellings, and certainly modern film and television like to imagine it. The saga tradition remembers a departure closer to theft than triumph. A handful of people pushing a half-trusted ship into dark water before dawn, while the rest of the village sleeps through what will later be remembered as the morning everything changed. And then there is only the sea. This is where the story slows again, deliberately, because the crossing itself is not a single dramatic event. It is an accumulation of small, grinding hardships stacked one on top of another until the line between bravery and simple endurance disappears entirely. The first days are the easiest, ironically, because the ship is still within the rough boundary of waters the crew has at least some second-hand familiarity with. The coastline shrinks behind them. Familiar landmarks fade. And then, on a morning indistinguishable in every visible way from the morning before it, there is nothing in any direction but water and sky, and the crew understands, all at once, and without needing to say it aloud, that they have crossed into water no one they know has ever charted. The fear that settles over a ship in that moment is not the dramatic, screaming fear of a single crisis. It is quieter and more corrosive than that. It is the fear of a slow, patient uncertainty, renewed every morning when the sun rises over exactly the same featureless horizon as the morning before. Norse sailors of this era navigated primarily by reading the sun, the stars, the behavior of seabirds, and the color and movement of the water itself, a body of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of coastal and open water sailing. But all of that knowledge had been built for routes someone had sailed before. Every technique Ragnar's crew relies on was designed to confirm a known path, not discover an unknown one. Out here, every reading they take is a guess, dressed up as a method. The weather does not cooperate, because the weather in the North Atlantic rarely does. The saga tradition and the broader cultural memory of Viking Age seafaring both preserve a healthy respect, bordering on reverence, for the sheer violence open ocean storms could bring. A storm at this stage of the journey is not simply uncomfortable, it is close to fatal, the kind of test that either ends a voyage in the first week or forges the people who survive it into something harder than they were when they left. Picture the ship pitching in swells taller than the mast, water sheeting over the sides faster than it can be bailed. Every man aboard working in a kind of grim, wordless coordination, because there is no longer room for fear to be spoken out loud. Ragnar, according to the way these stories remember him, does not retreat into the relative safety of command during moments like this. He is in the water with the rest of them, bailing alongside the lowest man on the crew, because a leader who built this ship plank by plank with his own hands does not suddenly become too important to save it with his own hands as well. There are quieter dangers too, the kind that do not arrive in a single dramatic night, but instead erode the crew slowly over the length of this crossing. Food rations, calculated for a voyage of uncertain length, begin to feel thinner with every passing day that the western horizon refuses to reveal anything. Fresh water grows precious enough that arguments, sharp and brief, start to flare over portions that would have seemed laughably generous back on land. Doubt, the same doubt that haunted Ragnar through those long preparatory seasons, spreads now through the entire crew, and it spreads in the particular way doubt always does on a ship with no possibility of turning back easily. Quietly at first, then in murmurs exchanged between two men at the oars, then, eventually, openly, directed at the man who convinced them all to follow a story told by a drunk trader who had never made this crossing himself. There is a moment, remembered across multiple versions of the saga tradition, in slightly different forms, when the crew's faith in Ragnar nearly breaks entirely. Days stretch past whatever rough estimate anyone aboard had quietly allowed themselves to hope for. The horizon offers nothing but more horizon. Someone, finally, says out loud what everyone has been thinking in private, that they have sailed off the edge of the known world, chasing a story that was never true. It is in this moment, more than in any single storm or any single act of physical bravery, that the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok actually begins to take its real shape, not in the swinging of a sword, in the holding of a course. The sagas describe him refusing to turn back, not with bluster or empty reassurance, but with the quiet, stubborn certainty of a man who has already spent 2 years of his life proving to an entire village that he does not abandon something simply because it has become difficult. He reminds the crew, according to the tradition, of everything they have already survived to reach this point, and asks them what exactly they imagine waits for them if they turn around now, with nothing to show for the voyage except the same mockery that sent them away in the first place. Better, he argues, to keep going toward whatever the horizon holds, even if that horizon holds nothing at all, than to return having proven their doubters right. It is not certainty that holds the crew together in that moment. Ragnar does not actually know any more than they do whether land lies ahead. What holds them is something closer to shared stubbornness, a collective refusal to let the voyage end in failure while there is still rope to row and water to drink. And then, on a morning that the storytellers across centuries have lingered over with particular care, something changes at the edge of the visible world, a shape on the horizon that is not quite cloud and not quite sea. Land. The shape on the horizon does not resolve itself quickly. For most of that first morning, it remains stubbornly ambiguous. A smudge that could be cloud, could be mist, could be the kind of hopeful illusion exhausted eyes invent when they have spent too many days staring at empty water. Nobody dares say the word out loud at first, as if naming it too early might cause it to vanish. But it does not vanish. It grows. By midday, the smudge has resolved into something unmistakable, a coastline. Green where the water meets the land, the unmistakable texture of cliffs and shore, rather than the flat, featureless mass of distant weather. The reaction aboard the ship, according to the way these moments are remembered and retold, is not immediate celebration. It is something quieter and stranger than that. The particular silence of people who have spent so long bracing for disappointment that they do not yet trust themselves to believe in relief. Ragnar, the storytellers insist, is the first to truly understand what the moment means, not only for the immediate survival of his crew, but for the entire shape of his life going forward. Every argument the village leaders made against him, every mocking dismissal, every quiet midnight doubt of his own, has just been answered by a line of green cliffs rising out of grey water. The horizon was not empty. It held exactly what he had staked everything on it holding. The land they have reached. In the framework, the legends and the broader historical context place around this moment lies somewhere along the coastline of what would become England, among the earliest Scandinavian contact with the British Isles in this particular wave of expansion. It is worth pausing here on a piece of genuine, well-documented history rather than saga embellishment, because the broader context matters enormously to understanding why this moment carried such explosive consequence. The late 8th and early 9th centuries mark the documented beginning of sustained Viking raiding activity against the British Isles, beginning most famously with the assault on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, an event so shocking to the Christian world of the time that contemporary chroniclers described it in terms of divine punishment and apocalyptic dread. Monasteries along these coastlines were, from a raider's perspective, almost absurdly undefended treasure houses, wealthy in portable silver, gold and finely crafted religious objects, populated mostly by monks with no meaningful capacity for armed resistance, and largely unprotected by the kind of fortification that secular settlements might maintain. Whether Ragnar's own legendary first crossing lines up precisely with any single documented raid is impossible to confirm with certainty, given how thoroughly saga and history have intertwined around his name by the time anyone wrote his story down. But the broader truth the story is built on is entirely real. For Scandinavian raiders of this period, the British Isles represented exactly the kind of undefended opportunity that could transform an ordinary man's fortunes overnight. And the earliest raiders to recognize and exploit that opportunity gained a kind of advantage that those who waited and followed never fully recovered. The first hours after landfall, in the way the tradition remembers them, are cautious rather than triumphant. The crew does not simply storm ashore. They study the coastline first, looking for signs of habitation, for the particular kind of architecture and activity that might indicate where the nearest settlement and the nearest wealth might be found. There is a discipline to this caution worth noting, because it complicates the simple image of Vikings as purely impulsive raiders, driven only by bloodlust. Successful raiding, the kind that built reputations and fortunes rather than ending in disaster on a foreign shore, required exactly this kind of patient reconnaissance. A crew this far from home, with no possibility of reinforcement and no familiar terrain to retreat into, could not afford recklessness. Every decision had to be calculated against the brutal mathematics of a small raiding party operating deep in hostile territory. When the raid itself finally comes, the storytelling tradition does not linger on it with the kind of grotesque detail later popular culture sometimes indulges in. What it emphasizes instead is the psychological impact, the sheer, world-shattering unfamiliarity of the experience. From the perspective of the people on the receiving end, the communities along this coastline have no living memory of this kind of threat. Their fortifications, where they exist at all, are built against local rivals and petty regional conflicts, not against ships full of well-armed strangers, arriving without warning, from a direction nobody thought to watch. The element of surprise that Ragnar's small, illegal, unsanctioned voyage achieves is not merely tactical. It is almost philosophical. He and his crew represent a category of danger that, as far as the people they encounter are concerned, should not exist at all. The wealth they recover, in the way the sagas remember it, exceeds anything that could have been earned through years of cautious Eastern trading. Silver, finely worked metal objects, goods and materials that, back in Scandinavia, would represent not just comfortable wealth, but the kind of fortune that fundamentally changes a man's standing within his community. This is the detail the storytelling tradition leans into hardest, because it is the detail that resolves the entire emotional arc the story has been building since Ragnar first stood on that ridge looking west. The farmer who was mocked for chasing an unprovable rumor returns, if he returns at all, not merely vindicated but transformed, carrying physical, undeniable proof that his judgment was sound when an entire village's collective wisdom said otherwise. But it would be a disservice to the real texture of this moment to frame it only as triumph, because the crossing back is its own trial, arguably a harder one than the crossing out, carrying now not just provisions but cargo, riding lower in the water, more vulnerable to the same storms and uncertainties that nearly broke the crew's resolve on the way over. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here. Having achieved the thing he set out to achieve, Ragnar must now survive the return journey with everything to lose rather than everything to prove, a different and in some ways more frightening kind of pressure. The sagas, characteristically, do not dwell long on this return crossing, eager as storytelling traditions across cultures tend to be, to move quickly from triumph to consequence. But it is worth imagining, for a moment, what that return voyage must have actually felt like from the inside. A crew that left as outcasts and failures in the eyes of their own community, now carrying the means to silence every single person who doubted them, and still not entirely certain, until the moment their own familiar coastline finally reappears on the horizon, that the sea will actually let them keep what they have won. When the ship finally does return, low in the water with its hard-earned cargo, to the same fjord it slipped out of in near secrecy 2 seasons earlier, the reception the storytelling tradition imagines is not a simple, uncomplicated celebration. It is something more layered than that, the particular mixture of vindication and resentment that greets anyone who proves powerful people wrong in front of an entire community. There is awe, certainly, at the wealth being unloaded onto the shore, wealth that visibly exceeds anything the eastern trading routes had produced for the village in living memory. But there is also, woven through that awe, the quieter discomfort of chieftains who publicly mocked a young farmer's ambition and now must find some way to live, alongside the fact that he was right and they were wrong, in front of the exact community whose respect their authority depends on. This is the turning point the entire shape of the story has been building toward, and it is worth being precise about what actually changes in this moment. Because it is not simply that Ragnar becomes wealthy, What changes is something more fundamental than money. Ragnar has demonstrated, in the most undeniable way available to a man of his era, judgment that exceeded the judgment of his community's established leadership. He looked at an unprovable rumor and correctly assessed it as truth, while wiser, more cautious men dismissed it as foolishness. In a culture where leadership was earned at least as much as inherited, this single act of vindicated judgment is worth more than the silver itself. The farmer who once stood on a ridge, invisible to everyone around him, except as a mild irritant to the established order, has become something else entirely. Not yet a king. Not yet the figure who will one day make the kings of England and Francia tremble at the mere mention of his name. But something has shifted permanently in how the village, and soon the wider region, understands who he is and what he is capable of. The horizon he refused to stop staring at has finally stared back, and what it revealed has changed the entire trajectory of his life. Word of a kind travels faster than ships in a society built on close-knit trading and kinship networks. And the story of the farmer who sailed west and returned wealthy beyond reasonable expectation does not stay contained within a single village for long. It moves along the same routes the Eastern traders use, carried by every sailor and merchant who passes through, growing larger and more dramatic with each retelling in the exact way every great legend eventually does. And as that story spreads, something begins happening that the young Ragnar, standing alone on his ridge 2 years earlier, could never have predicted with any certainty. People begin to follow him. It begins slowly, the way real transformations almost always do, regardless of how dramatic they appear in hindsight. A handful of young men from neighboring villages, hearing the story second-hand and then third-hand, make their way to Ragnar's settlement, not out of loyalty, but out of calculation. The same calculation his first crew made years earlier. If this man's judgment proved correct once, against the overwhelming weight of established opinion, perhaps it is worth wagering a season's labor on his judgment again. A second voyage follows, then a third, each one drawing more experienced men, better equipped, better resourced, because success in this world compounds the way it compounds in almost every era of human history. Wealth attracts skilled labor. Skilled labor improves the ships. Better ships survive harder crossings and reach further, richer targets. Within what the sagas compress into a deceptively short span of storytelling time, but what almost certainly represented years of patient, repeated effort, the farmer who once could not convince a single chieftain to support a single voyage finds himself commanding multiple ships, manned by experienced warriors who chose to follow him specifically, rather than simply inheriting his authority through bloodline or local custom. This is the period the legends compress most aggressively, eager to move from the underdog struggle toward the full scope of the legend's accomplishments. And it is worth resisting that same compression here, because the texture of this middle stretch of his life matters enormously to that, understanding the man he eventually becomes. Leadership of a Viking Age raiding force was not a passive position. A leader who lost ships, who misjudged a target's defenses, who failed to secure adequate plunder to justify the risk his men had taken alongside him, did not remain a leader for long. Authority in this world was renewed constantly, voyage by voyage, through demonstrated results rather than guaranteed by any prior achievement, however impressive. So when the sagas and the broader historical memory surrounding Ragnar's name describe his rise toward genuine prominence, what they are actually describing, beneath the dramatic individual episodes, is a sustained record of correct judgment, repeated often enough that it stopped looking like luck and started looking like a kind of mastery. He reads coastlines correctly. He reads the defensive capacity of unfamiliar settlements correctly. He reads, perhaps most importantly of all, the men under his command correctly, knowing which risks they will follow him into willingly and which risks will fracture the loyalty that everything else depends on. It is during this rising period, according to the saga tradition, that the women who shape so much of his legend enter the fuller scope of the story. Lagertha, The shield maiden, whose fierce independence first drew his attention, becomes for a time his wife. And the stories describe a partnership built as much on mutual respect for demonstrated capability. Later tradition describes a second wife, Thora, won according to legend through Ragnar's slaying of a monstrous serpent that had grown from a small gift into a creature large enough to encircle her father's hall. An episode almost certainly more myth than history, but one that speaks to how thoroughly the storytelling tradition wanted to mark him as a man capable of confronting threats beyond ordinary human scale. And then, in the fuller arc of the legend, comes Aslauga, described in the sagas as a woman of remarkable insight and prophetic capability, said to be the daughter of the legendary dragon slayer Sigurd and the shield maiden Brynhilda, figures drawn from the deepest, oldest layer of Norse heroic legend. Whatever the literal truth buried beneath that lineage, the symbolic weight is unmistakable. By the time the storytelling tradition brings Aslauga into Ragnar's life, it is explicitly weaving him into the oldest and most prestigious threads of Norse mythology itself. It is through these unions, and particularly through Aslauga, that the sons arrive, who would eventually eclipse even their father's formidable reputation. Ivar, whose physical condition, described across the tradition in terms suggesting some manner of significant disability, did nothing to diminish and arguably intensified his eventual reputation as one of the most strategically formidable commanders of the entire Viking age. Bjorn, called Ironside for a toughness that became its own legend. Sigurd, marked from birth, according to the stories, with a serpent-shaped pattern in his eye, a detail the sagas treat as an omen of destiny rather than mere coincidence. Each of these sons would go on to carve their own substantial place in the historical and legendary record, leading raids and conquests that genuine historians, working from sources independent of the more fantastical saga material, take considerably more seriously as documented history. This detail matters enormously to understanding why Ragnar's legend achieved the staying power it did. He is not remembered merely as an individually impressive raider, however accomplished. He is remembered as the origin point of an entire dynasty of feared warriors, a man whose ambition did not simply enrich himself, but planted the seed of a family whose collective impact on European history would prove genuinely seismic. The raids themselves, during this rising period, grow steadily more ambitious in scope and audacity. And here, the historical record, independent of saga embellishment, becomes considerably more solid. Among the most significant and well-documented episodes associated with Ragnar's name is the raid on Paris in the year 845, an event recorded not merely in the more mythologized Norse saga tradition, but in contemporary Frankish chronicles, written by people who lived through the experience and had every reason to record it accurately, if with understandable horror. A Viking fleet, sailing up the Seine with a force the Frankish sources describe, in terms reflecting genuine alarm, reached the heart of Frankish territory and extracted from King Charles the Bald an enormous ransom in silver, an amount that contemporary accounts place at roughly £7,000, paid specifically to convince the raiders to withdraw rather than sack the city outright. This single episode, regardless of exactly how much of the broader Ragnar legend maps precisely onto the historical leader of that specific raid, illustrates something crucial about the scale his ambition had reached by this point in the story. He is no longer simply raiding undefended monasteries along remote coastlines. He is striking directly at the seat of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe, and rather than being driven off or destroyed, he is extracting tribute on a scale that fundamentally altered how Frankish rulers approached the entire question of Viking raids going forward, establishing a precedent of paying for peace that would shape Frankish and eventually English policy toward Scandinavian raiders for generations to come, with consequences that historians still debate regarding whether such payments discouraged or actually encouraged further raiding. The psychological dimension of this transformation deserves attention too, because it is easy, focused purely on the external accumulation of wealth and territory, to lose sight of what is happening internally to the man at the center of the story. The farmer who once could not convince a single chieftain to support his ambition now commands the kind of force that makes the rulers of major European kingdoms negotiate rather than simply fight. The restlessness that once made him an irritant to his own small community has become, on this much larger stage, an asset so valuable that men travel considerable distances specifically to place themselves under his command. And yet, threaded through even the most triumphant episodes of this rising period, the saga tradition preserves something that prevents the story from collapsing into simple, uncomplicated glorification. A persistent undercurrent of restlessness that never fully resolves, even at the height of his power. The horizon that once represented an unknown, unconquered mystery has, piece by piece, raid by raid, become known territory. Francia has been struck. The British coastlines have been raided repeatedly. The wealth that once seemed unimaginable has accumulated to a degree that, by any reasonable measure, should satisfy even the most ambitious man's hunger. It does not entirely satisfy his. And this detail, more than any single battle or any single treasure hoard, is what the storytelling tradition seems most determined to preserve about his character, because it explains, more honestly than any simple narrative of triumph could, the decisions that eventually lead him toward his final, most consequential mistake. By the time the legend reaches its final chapter, Ragnar is no longer a young man chasing an unproven horizon. He is older now, his reputation enormous, his sons grown into warriors and leaders whose own accomplishments have begun, in the way the saga tradition tells it, to quietly outpace their fathers. And it is here, according to the legendary account, that the old restlessness reasserts itself in a far more dangerous form than it ever took during his youth. Not curiosity this time, but something closer to pride. A need to prove that the man who once sailed into unknown water still has something left to prove against sons whose fame has begun to eclipse his own. The sagas describe him setting out for England once more, late in his life, with a force the storytellers themselves frame as recklessly small. A deliberate understatement chosen, the tradition suggests, specifically to make the achievement more impressive if it succeeded. Whatever the literal truth behind this final voyage, the symbolic shape of the decision echoes uncomfortably with the very beginning of the story. Once again, a man sails toward England against the better judgment of those around him, certain that his instincts, proven correct so many times before, will not fail him now. This time, they do. The ship is driven off course, according to the tradition, by weather that will not cooperate the way it grudgingly cooperated decades earlier, and Ragnar finds himself ashore in Northumbria with a force too small to withstand the response his arrival provokes. He is captured by the forces of King Attila, a Northumbrian ruler the historical record treats with considerably more confidence than it treats most of details of Ragnar's own life, and brought before him not as a respected adversary to be ransomed, but as a notorious raider whose long career of plunder Aella has every reason to want, ended permanently and memorably. The execution the legend describes is among the most vivid and enduring images to survive from the entire saga tradition. Ragnar, the stories say, is thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes, a punishment chosen specifically for its cruelty and its symbolism. A man who spent his life ruling the open sea, reduced in his final hours to a confined, writhing darkness he cannot escape through skill or courage alone. And yet what the tradition chooses to preserve about those final moments is not despair, it is defiance, rendered in a form so striking that it has outlived nearly every other detail of his story. Rather than begging, rather than breaking, the dying Ragnar is remembered composing poetry even as the venom works through him, reportedly laughing and speaking words that have echoed across the centuries since, in one form or another. How the little piglets would grunt. He is said to have declared, "If they knew how the old boar suffers," a final, defiant prophecy aimed squarely at his own sons, a promise wrapped inside an insult, daring them to answer his death with the same fury he had spent his entire life cultivating in them. It is worth pausing honestly here, the way any careful telling of this story should, to acknowledge that historians remain genuinely divided over how much of this final episode reflects real events. Some scholars argue that Ragnar's actual death likely occurred earlier and far less dramatically, perhaps during raids along the Irish Sea sometime in the early 850s, with the elaborate snake pit execution layered on afterward by storytellers eager to give their hero an ending worthy of his life. One final act of myth-making added to a figure who had already absorbed centuries of embellishment by the time anyone wrote his story down. Others maintain that some version of a violent end at Ayla's hands carries enough independent corroboration, particularly in how directly it connects to events that are far better documented, to deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal as pure invention. What is not seriously disputed is what happened next, because here the saga tradition and the hard historical record finally converge with unusual clarity. In the year 865, a vast Scandinavian force that English chroniclers came to call the Great Heathen Army landed in England, and led it were men the Anglo-Saxon chronicle itself names as Ragnar's sons. This was not an ordinary raid. It was a sustained campaign of conquest that would, over the following years, topple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one after another, reshaping the political map of England for generations, and laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Danelaw, a vast stretch of England under direct Scandinavian rule and influence. Whether the army's stated purpose, vengeance for their father's death, reflects the literal historical motivation of its leaders, or a later narrative imposed on already existing ambitions is, again, a question historians continue to debate without full resolution. But the symbolic truth embedded in that story is one worth sitting with, regardless of where the precise historical line falls. A farmer, who once stood alone on a ridge, dismissed by everyone around him, had, by the end of his life, built something so large that his death alone was enough to summon one of the most consequential invasions in English history. This is, in the end, the shape of the story worth carrying away from this long, slow telling of it. Not simply the image of a man thrown into a pit, defiant to his last breath, though that image alone has proven powerful enough to survive more than 1,000 years of retelling. The deeper shape is the arc that carries an ordinary, restless farmer, doubted by every authority around him, toward a legacy so enormous that kings on the other side of the sea built fortifications and treaties around the mere memory of his name. The man who once looked beyond the horizon, certain of nothing except his own refusal to stop looking, became the reason others learned to fear what eventually came from it. Not because he was given power, but because he built it, plank by plank, voyage by voyage, doubt by doubt, out of nothing but stubbornness and a question nobody else around him was brave enough to ask. What is out there? It is a question every era answers in its own way, and the Viking Age answered it with longships and silver and fire along undefended coastlines. But underneath the specific, brutal details of that particular answer lies something far older and far more universal, the same restless pull that exists in anyone who has ever stood at the edge of a known, comfortable life and felt the unbearable weight of everything still unexplored beyond it. Ragnar Lothbrok, farmer, raider, husband, father, legend, did not become feared because the horizon handed him anything freely. He became feared because when everyone around him said the horizon was empty, he built a ship anyway and went to sea for himself. And history, in the end, remembers exactly what he found.